The Clark County Regional Justice Center stands as a sober monolith amidst the chaotic sprawl of Las Vegas. Located just miles from the neon excess of the Strip, the courthouse represents the morning-after reality of a city built on indulgence and risk. It is a place of hard surfaces, metal detectors, and the endless shuffling of paperwork that defines the American legal system. On the morning of the 3rd of January 2024, the building hummed with the routine bureaucratic noise of the new year. Lawyers reviewed case files in the hallways, marshals checked their equipment, and families waited on hard benches, anxious about the fates of their loved ones. Inside Department 18, the atmosphere was standard for a Wednesday docket, yet the undercurrent of tension that permeates any criminal sentencing hearing was palpable. This was the domain of District Court Judge Mary Kay Holthus, a veteran of the Nevada legal system whose career had been defined by a steadfast adherence to procedure and the protection of victims. Judge Mary Kay Holthus was not a newcomer to the harsh realities of criminal justice. Before ascending to the bench in January 2019, she had spent more than 27 years as a prosecutor with the Clark County District Attorney's Office. Her tenure as a deputy district attorney was marked by a specialization in special victims cases, specifically those involving domestic violence and sexual assault. She had spent decades confronting the ugliest aspects of human behavior, advocating for those who had been silenced or battered. In the legal community of Las Vegas, she was known as a straight shooter, a jurist who was thoroughly prepared, deeply knowledgeable about the sentencing guidelines, and unafraid to hand down significant prison time when the safety of the community was at risk. Her courtroom was her ship, run with a strict expectation of decorum and respect for the rule of law. By 2024, she had established a reputation as fair but firm, a judge who looked at the totality of a defendant's history rather than just the single charge on the docket. Standing opposite the bench on that January morning was 30-year-old Deobra Redden. His presence in the Justice Center was the culmination of a troubled trajectory that had intersected with the law repeatedly over the previous decade. Redden was a man familiar with the interior of a courtroom. His criminal record was substantial, marked by 3 prior felonies that painted a picture of escalating instability and violence. He was not a stranger to the judges of Clark County. He had previously been involved in the mental health court system, a specialized diversion program designed to address the root causes of criminal behavior in defendants diagnosing with psychiatric conditions. Redden had been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, conditions that the legal system had attempted to manage through probation and treatment rather than strictly through incarceration. The specific case bringing Redden before Judge Holthus on January 3rd involved a violent altercation that had occurred earlier. He was appearing for sentencing on a charge of attempted battery with substantial bodily harm. The incident had initially been charged as assault with a deadly weapon after Redden attacked a person with a baseball bat. The gravity of the offense was significant. It was a violent act that suggested a loss of control and a disregard for human safety. However, through the plea negotiation process common in the overburdened Las Vegas courts, the charge had been reduced. In November 2023, Redden had stood before Judge Holthus and pleaded guilty to the lesser charge. At that time, the judge had released him from custody while he awaited sentencing, a decision that allowed him to spend the holidays out of jail but required him to return in January to learn his fate. The dynamic in the courtroom was charged with the specific anxiety of a sentencing hearing where the outcome is binary and life-altering. Redden arrived at the Justice Center not in shackles, but as a free man on bail. He wore a white dress shirt and dark slacks, attempting to present an image of rehabilitation and compliance. He was accompanied by his attorney and family members, who were there to support his plea for leniency. The defense's objective was clear: secure probation. They argued that Redden's mental health struggles were the primary driver of his behavior and that he was making progress. They pointed to his recent employment and support system as evidence that he could be safely managed in the community without serving prison time. However, the legal machinery of Clark County is driven by records and risk assessments. The pre-sentence investigation report, a document reviewed by the judge prior to the hearing, likely detailed Redden's criminal history and his previous failures to comply with probationary terms. For Judge Holthus, the decision weighed heavily on the balance between rehabilitation and public safety. She had seen the cycle of violence repeat itself too many times in her career. The tension in Department 18 arose from this fundamental conflict, a defendant desperate to avoid a return to a cage, and a judge mandated to enforce consequences for violent actions. As the calendar moved through the morning's docket, the courtroom operated with the deceptive calm of routine. The court clerk managed the files. The court-marshal stood guard near the bench, a standard security presence intended to maintain order, and the gallery watched in silence. When Redden's case was called, he approached the defense table, his body language a mix of nervous energy and anticipation. He stood just feet away from the dais where Judge Holthus sat, elevated above the well of the court. The physical layout of the courtroom placed the judge at a distance deemed safe, behind a heavy wooden bench that served as both a workspace and a barrier. This architecture is designed to symbolize the authority of the court and to provide a layer of security for the jurist. The stakes could not have been higher for Redden. A sentence of probation would mean walking out the front doors of the Regional Justice Center back into the bright Nevada sunlight and his life. A sentence of incarceration would mean being taken into custody immediately, handcuffed by the marshal, and transported to the Clark County Detention Center, followed by a transfer to a state prison facility. The air in the room grew heavier as the hearing commenced. The polite exchanges of legal pleasantries between the defense attorney and the prosecutor did little to mask the severity of the moment. Judge Holthus reviewed the papers before her, her demeanor professional and focused. She listened to the arguments from the defense, who framed Redden as a man turning his life around, a new person who just needed one more chance. Redden himself spoke, his words aimed at convincing the woman in the black robe that he was not a danger, that he respected the court, and that he would not squander the opportunity for probation. But the judge had the cold, hard facts of his history on her screen. She knew about the prior felonies. She knew about the nature of the baseball bat attack. She knew that previous attempts at leniency had failed to stop his criminal behavior. The courtroom was a theater of conflicting narratives. To his family, Redden was a troubled young man needing help. To the state, he was a violent offender who had exhausted his chances. Judge Holthus sat at the convergence of these narratives, the sole arbiter of his future. The tension in the room was not the result of an outburst or a shout, but the quiet, suffocating pressure of an impending judgment. Every person in the room, the clerk, the marshal, the attorneys, and Redden himself, understood that the next few minutes would define the next several years. The system was working exactly as designed, proceeding methodically toward a conclusion that felt inevitable to the experienced eyes of the court staff, yet remained a desperate hope for the defendant standing before the bar. The scene was set with the rigid geometry of the law, totally unprepared for the chaos that was about to shatter the decorum of the 8th Judicial District Court. To understand the explosion of violence that occurred on the 3rd of January 2024, one must look back to the spring of the previous year, specifically the 23rd of April 2023. It was on this date that Deobra Redden's trajectory toward Judge Mary Kay Holthus's courtroom began, catalyzed by an aggressive confrontation that underscored his escalating volatility. The incident took place in a residential setting, the kind of domestic disturbance that police in Las Vegas encounter with wearying frequency, yet the particulars of this case revealed a dangerous capacity for inflicting harm. Redden had confronted a victim in a dispute that rapidly deteriorated from verbal abuse to physical menace. Witnesses and police reports detailed a chaotic scene where Redden, fueled by a mix of unchecked rage and alleged mental instability, threatened to shatter the kneecaps of the individual standing before him. He did not merely make verbal threats. He armed himself with a baseball bat, a blunt instrument capable of lethal force, and swung it with intent. The attack resulted in substantial bodily harm to the victim, marking a clear escalation from his previous nuisance crimes to significant interpersonal violence. When the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department officers arrived at the scene, the severity of the assault warranted immediate and serious charges. Redden was taken into custody, and the legal machinery of Clark County began to turn. He was initially booked on charges of assault with a deadly weapon, a felony that carries severe sentencing guidelines. The state's perspective was clear from the outset. This was not a minor scuffle or a misunderstanding. It was a violent act involving a weapon, perpetrated by a man who had demonstrated a willingness to maim. The baseball bat attack was the precipitating event, the singular act of violence that would eventually place him before Judge Holthus, but it was merely the latest chapter in a long, troubled narrative. To the prosecutors reviewing the file, Redden was not a first-time offender making a mistake. He was a recurring problem for the community. As the months passed between the arrest and the eventual sentencing hearing, the legal process involved a series of negotiations common in the overburdened American justice system. The district attorney's office, balancing the need for public safety with the practicalities of court scheduling and evidentiary standards, entered into plea discussions with Redden's defense counsel. The goal for the defense was to avoid the maximum penalty associated with assault with a deadly weapon and to frame Redden's actions within the context of his mental health struggles. Redden had been diagnosed with schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, conditions that his attorney argued impaired his judgment and impulse control. The defense contended that incarceration would not address the root cause of his behavior and that he was a candidate for rehabilitation rather than simple punishment. Through these negotiations, a plea deal was struck. Redden agreed to plead guilty to a reduced charge of attempted battery with substantial bodily harm. In the sterile language of the court, this reduction seemed like a victory for the defense, a legal maneuvering that technically lowered the ceiling of his potential punishment. The plea agreement included a recommendation regarding his sentence, but critically, in the Nevada legal system, a judge is not bound by the sentencing recommendations presented by the attorneys. The judge retains the ultimate discretion to accept or reject the terms of probation based on the defendant's history and the pre-sentencing investigation report. This nuance would prove fatal to the expectations of Redden and his family. They believed that by accepting responsibility and pleading guilty, Redden had secured a path toward probation, a chance to undergo mental health treatment outside the confines of a prison cell. However, the file that landed on Judge Holthus's desk contained more than just the details of the baseball bat attack. It contained a comprehensive criminal history that painted a bleak picture of Redden's past. By the time he stood in court in January 2024, Redden was a 3-time felon. His record was a litany of offenses that spanned his adult life, including convictions for domestic battery, theft, and malicious destruction of property. He had been given opportunities before. He had been through the revolving door of the justice system, appearing before various judges who had offered him probation, parole, and court-ordered programs. In the eyes of the Department of Parole and Probation, which prepares the pre-sentencing reports, Redden was a high-risk candidate. He had previously violated the terms of his release and had failed to complete court-mandated requirements. The report generated for Judge Holthus likely highlighted these failures, noting that past leniency had not resulted in a cessation of criminal activity. The build-up to the January 3rd hearing was characterized by a profound disconnect between Redden's expectations and the judicial reality he faced. On one side, Redden, his family, and his attorney were operating under the hope that the mental health court route would be granted. They had prepared statements emphasizing his support system, his willingness to take medication, and his desire to change. They viewed the plea deal as a contract of good faith. He had admitted guilt, and in return he expected the mercy of the court. His attorney had advocated tirelessly for a diversion program, arguing that prison would only exacerbate Redden's psychological condition and turn a troubled man into a hardened criminal. On the other side sat the unyielding facts of his recidivism. Judge Holthus, known for being a fair but firm jurist, had the responsibility of weighing the safety of the community against the needs of the defendant. She had reviewed the chronology of his offenses. She saw the pattern: a minor offense, a grant of probation, a violation, a slightly worse offense, another grant of probation, and now a violent attack with a baseball bat. The progression was undeniable. The escalation from property crimes to physical violence against a person suggested that Redden was becoming more dangerous, not less. The judge's duty was to interrupt this cycle. While the defense prepared to argue for another chance, The judicial logic leaned heavily toward incapacitation. The attempted battery with substantial bodily harm charge, while a reduction from the original count, still acknowledged that a victim had been physically injured. The state could not ignore the victim's right to justice. As the date of the hearing approached, the atmosphere surrounding Redden was one of anxious optimism mixed with denial. He did not prepare for prison. He did not make arrangements for a long absence. He arrived at the Regional Justice Center in downtown Las Vegas wearing a white shirt and dark pants, untethered by handcuffs, enjoying the freedom of a defendant out on bail. This freedom contributed to his false sense of security. He had been out of custody since the plea was entered, compliant with the temporary conditions of his release. In his mind, his compliance during this interim period proved he could be trusted on probation. He believed he had done everything asked of him. He had shown up. He had stayed out of trouble for the few weeks leading to the hearing. He interpreted this short period of stability as sufficient proof of his rehabilitation. The courtroom on that Wednesday morning was business as usual. The docket was full. Attorneys shuffled papers, and the gallery contained the usual mix of worried relatives and bored observers. When Redden's case was called, he approached the defense table with a casual demeanor, flanked by his attorney. The prosecutors stood ready, though they had already agreed to the plea and were largely leaving the final decision to the judge. The stakes were incredibly high, yet the procedural nature of the hearing masked the impending volatility. The discussion began with the standard legal formalities. The judge acknowledged the plea deal. Redden's attorney launched into the prepared mitigation argument, highlighting Redden's mental health diagnosis and the presence of his mother and sister in the courtroom as evidence of a strong support network. The defense attorney spoke passionately about Redden's struggles, framing the baseball bat attack not as an act of malice, but as a symptom of untreated illness. He implored Judge Holthus to look beyond the rap sheet and see the human being who needed treatment. He argued that sending Redden to prison would be a warehousing of the mentally ill, a failure of the system to address the root cause. Redden himself was given the opportunity to speak. He stood before the bench, unhandcuffed, and expressed remorse. He told the judge he was a person who never stops trying to do the right thing no matter how hard it is. He explicitly asked for leniency, stating, "I'm not a rebellious person." He attempted to project the image of a man who had learned his lesson, a man who was ready to comply with whatever non-custodial sentence the court deemed appropriate. However, the judge was looking at the paperwork that contradicted his self-assessment. She saw the history of domestic violence. She saw the multiple thefts. She saw the violation of trust in previous probations. The cognitive dissonance in the room was palpable. Redden was narrating a story of redemption. The documents before the judge narrated a story of chronic failure. The prosecutor, while abiding by the plea, did not vigorously argue against prison, silently allowing the record to speak for itself. The expectation of probation, so firmly held by Redden, began to disintegrate as Judge Holthus began to speak. She acknowledged the arguments of the defense but pivoted immediately to the criminal history. Her tone was not angry, but it was decisive. She was about to dismantle the narrative that Redden had constructed for himself. The tension in the air thickened as the judge signaled her intent. She mentioned the 3 felonies and the misdemeanors. She noted that he had tasted probation multiple times, and it had not worked. The realization that the plea deal would not save him from prison began to dawn on Redden. The build-up of months of legal maneuvering, the psychological evaluations, the family meetings, the assurances that it would be okay if he just pleaded guilty, all of it was collapsing in real time. The system had processed him, heard him, and found his arguments wanting. The impending sentence was not merely a rejection of his request for probation, it was a rejection of his perception of reality. He believed he deserved another chance. The court believed he had used them all up. This fundamental clash of perspectives, centered on the consequences of that April 2023 baseball bat attack, created a psychological pressure cooker within the defendant, primed to explode the moment the final word was handed down. The atmosphere inside Department 18 of the Regional Justice Center in Las Vegas on the morning of the 3rd of January 2024 was indistinguishable from any other routine sentencing calendar. The courtroom, characterized by its beige walls, recessed lighting, and the solemn seal of the state of Nevada positioned high on the wall, operated with the mechanical efficiency of a bureaucracy designed to process human error. Judge Mary Kay Holthus sat elevated behind the bench, a position that structurally enforced the hierarchy of the legal system. To her left sat her law clerk, Michael Lasso, managing the digital and physical paperwork that accompanied the docket. A courtroom marshal, Shane Brandon, stood near the side, a standard security presence in a room where emotions often ran high but rarely spilled over into physical chaos. Deobra Redden entered the well of the court not in shackles but in street clothes. He wore a crisp white dress shirt and dark trousers, an outfit chosen to project rehabilitation and respectability. He was out of custody, having been released on his own recognizance during previous proceedings, a fact that contributed to the general sense of calm in the room. There was no rattling of chains or the heavy presence of corrections officers flanking him. He stood beside his attorney, Cesar Almaz, at the defense table, looking less like a violent offender and more like a citizen attempting to resolve a misunderstanding. The illusion of safety was paramount. The system relied on the assumption that defendants, especially those appearing voluntarily, would adhere to the social contract of the courtroom. The case was called, and the proceedings began with the standard formalities. The charge was attempted battery with substantial bodily harm, a felony that carried the potential for incarceration, but one for which the defense had prepared a robust argument for probation. The stakes were absolute. Redden would either walk out the front door to continue his life or be taken through the side door into the holding cells to begin a prison term. The tension was internal, hidden behind professional courtesies and legal jargon. Cesar Almaz began his plea for leniency. His strategy was grounded in the context of Redden's personal struggles and his recent diagnosis. Almaz addressed the court with a measured tone, aiming to humanize his client before the judge could categorize him solely by his criminal record. The defense attorney emphasized that Redden had been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. This dual diagnosis, Almaz argued, was the root cause of the behavioral issues that had brought Redden before the court. He posited that incarceration would serve no rehabilitative purpose for a man suffering from severe mental health episodes. Instead, it would merely warehouse him without addressing the underlying pathology. Almaz urged Judge Holthus to consider the Mental Health Court, a specialized diversion program designed to provide treatment and supervision rather than straight imprisonment. He argued that Redden was a prime candidate for this approach. He pointed out that despite the gravity of the charges, Redden had secured employment and had a support system in place. The defense painted a picture of a man who was finally stabilizing, a man who was taking the necessary steps to integrate into society as a productive member. Almaz noted that Redden had been substantially compliant with recent directives, suggesting that the defendant was not defiant, but rather a person in need of structured medical assistance. The argument was a standard, compassionate plea. Treat the illness, and you cure the criminal behavior. When it was Redden's turn to speak, he reinforced his attorney's narrative. He stood straight, addressing Judge Holthus with a demeanor that seemed earnest and polite. His voice was steady, lacking the tremors of nervousness often heard at sentencing. He sought to bridge the gap between the defendant's table and the bench by appealing to his own humanity. "I'm not a rebellious person," Redden told the judge. He described himself as a person who never stopped trying to do the right thing, regardless of how difficult the circumstances were. He spoke of his new job, framing it as evidence of his commitment to a law-abiding life. He told the court that he did not believe he should be sent to prison, but he added a caveat that was intended to show maturity. "But if I am, I'm going to learn from it." Redden's allocation was a performance of contrition. He did not raise his voice. He did not argue the facts of the attempted battery charge. Instead, he focused on the future, asking the court to bet on his potential rather than punish his past. He portrayed himself as a man who had made mistakes but was not defined by them. He stood within the small swinging gate that separated the gallery from the well, his body language relaxed, his hands gesturing naturally. To any observer in the gallery, he appeared to be a defendant who fully expected to go home that afternoon. The disconnect between his calm presentation and the violence documenting his file was absolute. He was effectively asking the court to trust the man standing before them over the paper record on the judge's desk. Judge Holthus listened patiently. She did not interrupt the defense attorney or the defendant, allowing them to make their record fully. However, her eyes frequently consulted the documents before her. The file contained the details that the white shirt and polite words could not erase. While Almase and Redden spoke of mental health and new beginnings, the judge was looking at a history of offenses. The dichotomy of the courtroom was on full display. The defense focused on the potential of the individual, while the court focused on the protection of the community and the consequences of prior actions. As Redden finished speaking, the courtroom fell into the brief, heavy silence that always precedes a judicial pronouncement. The air conditioning hummed, a low drone beneath the fluorescent lights. The clerk, Michael Lasso, kept his hands near his keyboard, ready to log the disposition. Marshal Shane Brandon stood casually, his posture relaxed, having seen thousands of such hearings proceed without incident. There was no visible indicator of the kinetic energy building at the defense table. Judge Holthus began her ruling. Her voice was firm, devoid of anger, but heavy with the authority of the state. She acknowledged the arguments presented by Almase regarding Redden's mental health. She acknowledged the diagnosis of schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. However, her perspective on the appropriate remedy differed sharply from the defense's proposal. She shifted the focus from Redden's medical chart to his criminal history. She began to articulate the reasoning that would dismantle Redden's hope for probation. The judge's demeanor was decisive. She was not swayed by the new job or the claims of compliance. She looked directly at Redden, not with malice, but with the clinical detachment of a jurist who had seen too many chances squandered. She noted the nature of the charge, attempted battery with substantial bodily harm, and viewed it not as an isolated incident stemming from a lack of medication, but as part of a continuing pattern of violence that endangered the public. The mental health court option, while valid for many, was deemed insufficient for the risk she believed Redden posed. The energy in the room began to shift subtly as the judge continued. The hope that Almase had constructed began to evaporate with every sentence Holthus spoke. She was dismantling the defense's narrative brick by brick. She referenced the victim, the harm caused, and the failure of previous interventions. She made it clear that the court's patience had been exhausted. The polite young man in the white shirt was being redefined, in real time, as a danger to the community. Redden stood motionless, listening. The reality of the situation was settling in. The plea for probation, the arguments about his job, the appeals to his mental state, none of it was working. The judge was looking at the totality of the circumstances, and the balance was tipping heavily toward incarceration. The marshal, sensing the direction the hearing was taking, began to make subtle preparations, shifting his stance slightly, readying himself for the routine procedure of taking a defendant into custody. This usually involved a verbal order, a request for the defendant to place their hands behind their back, and the clicking of handcuffs. It was a choreography practiced daily in the Regional Justice Center. Judge Holthus reached the conclusion of her assessment. She looked down at the paperwork, then back up at the defendant. She delivered the line that signaled the end of Deobra Redden's freedom. "I appreciate that," she said, referring to his statement, "but I think it's time he gets a taste of something else." The words were colloquial but carried the weight of a final judgment. It was a rejection of the status quo. It was a declaration that the cycle of probation and second chances was over. The sentence was not merely a number of years. It was a physical revocation of autonomy. The judge was ordering him to prison. The clerk prepared to finalize the minute entry. The marshal took a step forward, reaching for the handcuffs on his belt, preparing to close the distance between himself and Redden to effectuate the arrest. The courtroom procedure was unfolding exactly as the statute dictated. The verbal portion of the hearing was concluding, and the physical transfer of custody was commencing. In that fraction of a second, the social contract dissolved. The judge had barely finished her sentence when the atmosphere shattered. The transition from a civil proceeding to a violent encounter did not happen gradually. It was instantaneous. The rejection of probation was the catalyst. The realization that he was not going home, that the taste of something else, meant the confines of a prison cell, triggered a reaction that bypassed all legal and social protocols. Redden did not slump his shoulders in defeat. He did not turn to his attorney for an explanation. The polite facade vanished, replaced by a raw, explosive rejection of the court's authority. The distance between the defense table and the judicial bench, a zone of protected space designed to ensure the safety of the magistrate, suddenly seemed negligible. The barrier of the bench, a heavy wooden structure meant to symbolize the separation of powers and provide physical security, was reduced to a mere obstacle to be overcome. The bailiff was moving, but the timing was off. The rhythm of the courtroom had been disrupted by an action that defied the logic of the setting. The judge, still seated, looked up, her expression shifting from judicial resolve to sudden comprehension of a threat. The words, "I think it's time he gets a taste of something else," hung in the air, the final rational statement before the eruption of irrational violence. The hearing was over. The attack was beginning, a mere hurdle to be cleared by a man possessed by sudden, kinetic rage. The transition from standing defendant to airborne assailant occurred in a time frame that defied the typical reaction speeds of the judicial officers present. As the expletive, "Nah, fuck that bitch," left his lips, Deobra Redden was already in motion. The physics of the courtroom shifted instantly from a static procedural environment to a scene of violent kinetic energy. Redden did not attempt to walk around the defense table or navigate the aisle. He treated the courtroom furniture as obstacles on a track. He planted his feet and launched himself forward, sprinting toward the dais. The movement was linear and predatory, ignoring the bailiff standing nearby and the attorneys frozen in their spots. In 2 strides, he reached the wooden partition, separating the well of the court from the elevated bench. This structure, designed to enforce a respectful distance, became a launching pad. Redden vaulted. The video footage captured the surreal mechanics of the leap. Redden's body went horizontal, fully extended in the air, resembling a linebacker, diving for a tackle or a stuntman performing a high fall. He cleared the judge's desk, a wide expanse of polished wood covered in files, monitors, and water pitchers with terrifying athleticism. At this specific moment, Judge Mary Kay Holthus realized the threat was no longer verbal. Her eyes widened, processing the incoming mass of the defendant flying directly toward her head. There was no time to stand, no time to flee to the chambers behind her. The judge's survival instinct triggered a purely reactive motor response. She recoiled, throwing her body backward and down, attempting to put the bulk of her high-backed leather chair and the desk itself between her and Redden. It was a desperate attempt to minimize the target area. As she ducked, the serenity of the courtroom shattered. Redden landed directly on top of the judge. The impact was audible, a sickening thud of bodies colliding with furniture and the floor. The force of his landing drove the judge's head backward against the wall behind the bench. The American flag, standing on a heavy pole to the judge's right, was knocked over in the collision, crashing down onto the pile of struggling bodies, adding to the visual chaos and tangling the combatants in heavy fabric. The judge's computer monitor toppled, and papers scattered into the air like confetti. The soundscape of the room changed instantly from the low hum of legal proceedings to a cacophony of screams, grunts, and crashing equipment. The heavy wooden chair the judge had occupied seconds earlier was shoved violently aside as Redden scrambled to maintain his hold on her, grabbing at her hair and shoulders. He was not merely restraining her. He was attacking with intent, his hands seeking purchase on her head and neck. Marshal Shane Brandon, the uniformed officer charged with courtroom security, had reacted the moment Redden began his sprint. However, the geometry of the room worked against him. He was positioned to the side, and Redden's direct line of attack meant Brandon had to chase the defendant from a disadvantaged angle. Brandon reached the bench a split second after Redden's feet left the floor. The marshal did not hesitate. He threw his body into the fray, diving over the desk in an attempt to intercept the defendant in midair or immediately upon landing. The collision between the marshal and the defendant was messy and brutal. Brandon caught a piece of Redden, but the momentum of the leap carried them both down into the cramped crawl space behind the judge's desk. As they crashed to the floor, Redden kicked out, his limbs flailing with hysterical strength. In the confined space, Brandon absorbed a severe impact. As he attempted to grapple with the younger, agitated man, the marshal's shoulder took the brunt of the force. The joint was wrenched violently out of its socket, a dislocation that sent a shockwave of debilitating pain through the officer's arm. Despite the injury, Brandon refused to disengage, using his remaining strength to try and pull Redden's mass off Judge Holthus. Simultaneously, Michael Lasso, the judge's law clerk who had been seated at a desk adjacent to the bench, joined the counterattack. Lasso, wearing a suit and tie, was not a security officer, yet his reaction was immediate and pivotal. Seeing the judge disappearing under the weight of the defendant, Lasso rounded his desk and charged the bench. He did not attempt to negotiate the barrier. Like Redden, he vaulted the workspace to get to the epicenter of the violence. Lasso arrived as Redden was thrashing against the injured marshal and the trapped judge. The clerk grabbed Redden by the shoulders, attempting to peel him away. The struggle was frantic. Redden, fueled by an adrenaline dump, seemed impervious to pain or reason. He continued to swing his fists, striking the judge and the marshal indiscriminately. Lasso, realizing that pulling might not be enough, began striking back, delivering a series of blows to Redden's upper body in an effort to stun him into submission. It was a raw, unchoreographed brawl taking place in the holiest precinct of the courtroom. Beneath the pile, Judge Holthus was pinned against the wall and the floor. She curled into a defensive ball, protecting her head with her arms as Redden's weight pressed the air from her lungs. She could feel the blows landing around her, the weight of the men crushing her against the cabinetry. The back of her head had struck the wall with significant force during the initial takedown, leaving her dizzy and disoriented amidst the melee. The struggle behind the bench lasted for several terrifying seconds that felt like minutes to the witnesses in the gallery. Attorneys and bystanders stood frozen in shock, hands over their mouths, watching the flags and monitors shake violently as the battle raged on the floor. The microphone at the judge's bench, now dislodged, picked up the guttural sounds of the fight, the straining breath of the men, the dull thuds of impact, and the profanities Redden continued to scream even as he was being subdued. More officers rushed into the room, their boots pounding on the carpet as they swarmed the dais. They had to navigate the narrow access points to get behind the bench. It required the combined weight of multiple grown men to finally pry Deobra Redden off the victims. They dragged him out from the crawlspace, his suit jacket torn, his face contorted in rage. Even as they hauled him into the well of the court, he continued to spit threats, his resistance undimmed by the overwhelming force now applied against him. "I hope you die," he screamed, his voice cracking with exertion, directed back toward the pile of debris where the judge lay. As the officers pinned Redden to the carpet, applying handcuffs and leg restraints, attention turned desperately to the carnage behind the bench. The scene resembled the aftermath of a localized natural disaster. The judge's chair was overturned. The Nevada state flag and the American flag were draped over the desk like shrouds. Water from a smashed pitcher soaked the carpet and the legal files scattered across the floor. Marshal Shane Brandon was the first to emerge, his face grimacing in agony. He clutched his arm, holding it close to his body to support the dislocated shoulder. Blood dripped from a gash on his forehead, a laceration sustained when his face struck the corner of the desk or the floor during the tackle. The blood smeared onto his uniform shirt, a stark red against the gray fabric. He was breathing heavily, his complexion paling as the shock of the injury set in. He leaned against the wall, unable to use his arm, waiting for medical assistance. Law clerk Michael Lasso stood up, dusting off his suit. His hands were scraped and abraded from the friction of the carpet and the impact of his strikes. He was winded, his chest heaving, but his primary focus was scanning the floor for the judge. He reached down to help clear the debris. Slowly, Judge Holthus was assisted to her feet. She appeared shaken, her hair disheveled, her robe twisted. She held a hand to the back of her head, where her skull had impacted the wall. The adrenaline that had allowed her to duck and cover was beginning to fade, replaced by the throbbing ache of blunt force trauma. She was not bleeding profusely, but the neurological impact was immediate. She appeared unsteady, her eyes darting around the ruined workspace, processing the violation of her safety. The physical toll of the 30-second explosion of violence was quantifiable and severe. Marshal Shane Brandon required immediate hospitalization. The dislocation of his shoulder was significant, involving damage to the ligaments that would require extensive rehabilitation. The gash on his face required stitches. He had thrown his body into the path of a violent offender to protect a magistrate, sustaining permanent damage to his shoulder joint in the process. Judge Holthus suffered injuries consistent with a physical assault and a fall. She sustained a contusion to the head from the impact with the wall, resulting in lingering soreness and stiffness in her neck and back. The psychological impact of being hunted and crushed in her own seat of authority was compounded by the physical bruising across her upper body, where Redden had grabbed her and where she had struck the floor. Michael Lasso, whose intervention was credited with likely saving the judge from more severe injury, suffered minor cuts and deep abrasions on his knuckles and hands. His injuries were the result of the physical strikes he delivered to Redden's face and body to stop the assault. Deobra Redden, now shackled and surrounded by a phalanx of deputies, was hoisted to his feet. His face showed no remorse, only the wild-eyed look of a man coming down from a violent peak. He was marched out of the courtroom, leaving behind a scene of absolute destruction. The silence that returned to the courtroom was heavy and suffocating. The bailiff signaled for the gallery to clear, but few moved immediately, their eyes fixed on the judge, who was now sinking into a chair brought by a staff member, holding an ice pack to her head. The courtroom, usually a place of rigid order and procedural safety, had been turned into a crime scene. Crime scene investigators would later photograph the toppled flags, the blood droplets on the carpet where Marshal Brandon had bled, and the chaotic disarray of the judge's bench. The attack had breached the sanctity of the court in a way that few previous incidents ever had. The distance between the public and the judiciary, once thought to be safe, had been closed in a single violent leap. The immediate aftermath involved a triage of the victims. Paramedics arrived with stretchers and medical bags. Marshal Brandon was loaded onto a gurney, his pain visible. Judge Holthus declined a stretcher but was escorted out for medical evaluation, her steps careful and slow. The clerk, Lasso, remained behind to give a statement to the police, his hands shaking slightly as the adrenaline left his system. The physical damage was documented, the hematomas, the lacerations, the joint separations. But the image of Redden soaring over the bench, the visual manifestation of a complete breakdown of law and order, remained the defining scar of the event. Head stabilized by a cervical collar to prevent further injury to his neck and spine. The 25-year veteran of the force had absorbed the initial kinetic energy of the collision, his body serving as the primary shield between the assailant and the jurist. As emergency medical technicians maneuvered the stretcher through the narrow well of the courtroom, the extent of the violence became quantifiable. Brandon had sustained a dislocation of his shoulder and a deep facial laceration that required immediate suturing. The adrenaline that had fueled his response was beginning to fade, replaced by the acute shock of the trauma. He was wheeled out of Department 62, past the stunned gallery, and into the secure corridors of the Regional Justice Center, en route to University Medical Center's trauma unit. Judge Mary Kay Holthus remained in the courtroom initially, her demeanor a mixture of judicial stoicism and physical disorientation. While she had insisted on checking the welfare of her marshal and law clerk first, the physical toll of the assault was becoming evident. The impact against the wall behind her bench had been severe. She had suffered injuries to her head and neck, contusions that would darken significantly in the coming hours. Colleagues and court staff crowded the doorway, their faces etched with disbelief, urging her to seek medical attention. She eventually consented, allowing paramedics to examine her injuries away from the public eye. The presiding judge, a figure of absolute authority within those four walls just minutes prior, was now a victim in an active crime scene, being escorted out of her own courtroom by medical personnel. Michael Lasso, the law clerk who had effectively intervened to pull Redden off the judge, sat near the defense table, his hands trembling slightly as the adrenaline dump took hold. His hands were cut and scraped, minor injuries relative to the potential outcome, yet significant enough to require medical cleaning and dressing. He provided a brief statement to the arriving detectives, his account corroborating the chaotic sequence of events. The courtroom, usually a place of verbal argumentation and procedural order, was now silent, save for the squawk of police radios and the low murmur of investigators. The air still held the metallic scent of stress and exertion. Deobra Redden, having been dragged from the courtroom by a phalanx of officers, was no longer merely a defendant in a battery case. He was now classified as a high-threat inmate. He was transported directly to the Clark County Detention Center, bypassing the standard holding cells adjacent to the courtrooms. The transport team maintained maximum restraints, shackling his hands and feet and monitoring him closely for any further outbursts. During the transfer, Redden remained agitated. His demeanor did not suggest remorse, but rather a continuation of the rage that had propelled him over the bench. He was placed in an isolation unit, separated from the general population, as jail administrators initiated protocols for inmates who pose an extreme danger to staff. The booking charge list expanded rapidly, adding multiple counts of battery on a protected person and seemingly confirming that his opportunity for probation had been irrevocably extinguished. Back in the courtroom, the secure perimeter was established. Crime scene analysts began the process of documenting the aftermath. They photographed the disarray behind the bench, the scattered files, and the blood evidence. The Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department treated the area with the same rigor applied to a street-level assault. Every angle was captured to preserve the physical reality of the attack, ensuring that the visual evidence matched the testimonial accounts. The doors to Department 62 were locked, and a notice was posted canceling the remainder of the day's docket. The ripple effect was felt throughout the Regional Justice Center. As news of the attack spread from floor to floor, other judges paused their hearings. Bailiffs in neighboring courtrooms tightened their proximity to defendants. The illusion of safety that usually permeates the judicial complex had been shattered, replaced by a tense hypervigilance. Simultaneously, a different kind of investigation was unfolding in the control room of the Courthouse Security Center. Technicians and security supervisors rewound the digital feed from the courtroom's ceiling-mounted cameras. The incident had been captured on the official record, a system designed to document legal proceedings, not hand-to-hand combat. As they played back the footage, the sheer suddenness of the event was startling even to seasoned professionals. The video showed Redden standing at the lectern, the verbal exchange, and then the explosive movement. The camera captured the vault, a feat of athleticism that defied the expected physical limitations of a courtroom setting and the subsequent melee. The audio, crisp and clear, recorded the shouting, the thud of bodies, and the alarm of the bystanders. It was this piece of evidence, the digital record of the assault, that would soon transcend the legal proceedings and become a global phenomenon. Within hours, the footage was secured as evidence. But in the modern era of digital transparency, containment is rarely absolute. Whether released officially to demonstrate the severity of the attack or leaked through other channels, the video file made its way onto the internet. The dissemination was instantaneous. It appeared first on local news outlets in Las Vegas, then jumped to national cable networks, and finally exploded across social media platforms. The reaction of the public was a mixture of horror, fascination, and dark humor. On platforms like X and TikTok, the clip was viewed millions of times within the first afternoon. The visual of a defendant launching himself over a high judicial bench became an instant viral moment. Internet users dissected the footage frame by frame. They analyzed the reaction time of the marshal, the positioning of the judge, and the trajectory of Redden's leap. The sheer absurdity of the image, a man flying through the air in a court of law, led to a wave of memes and commentary that often divorced the image from the violence it depicted. For the internet at large, it was content. For the victims nursing their injuries in local hospitals, it was a life-altering trauma. However, beyond the superficial engagement of social media, the video served a critical evidentiary purpose. It removed any ambiguity regarding the events. There was no, "he said," she said. The intent was visible in the wind-up and the launch. The footage showed Redden bypassing the initial attempt by the marshal to block him, demonstrating a singular focus on reaching Judge Holthus. This visual evidence was immediately flagged by the district attorney's office as the cornerstone of the new case against Redden. It was undeniable proof of the assault's ferocity and the target's vulnerability. As the sun set on Las Vegas that evening, the Regional Justice Center began to empty, but the atmosphere remained heavy. The cleaning crews were held back from Department 62 until the investigation was fully cleared. In the hospital, Judge Holthus was discharged, leaving with strict instructions for rest and monitoring for concussion symptoms. Marshal Brandon remained under care, facing a longer road to recovery with his orthopedic injuries. The legal community in Clark County began to mobilize, with the chief judge and court administration issuing statements condemning the violence and promising a full review of security protocols. The shock among the onlookers who had been in the gallery lingered long after they were interviewed and released. Redden's foster mother and sister, who had been present to support him during the sentencing, were left to grapple with the catastrophic turn of events. They had witnessed the explosion of violence from feet away, helpless to intervene. Their testimonies to the police reflected a state of profound distress, caught between their relationship with the defendant and the undeniable brutality of his actions. By the next morning, the footage had been broadcast on every continent. The Las Vegas courtroom attack led news bulletins in Europe and Asia, prompting debates about courtroom security standards worldwide. The image of the empty, toppled chair behind the bench became a symbol of the vulnerability of the justice system. The immediate aftermath had transitioned from the physical securing of a room to a global conversation about safety, mental health, and the unpredictable nature of violence. Deobra Redden was now the most famous inmate in Nevada. His face and his flight broadcast to millions, while the machinery of the justice system he had attacked began to turn against him with renewed, inexorable force. The investigation into the attack was closed quickly. The evidence was incontrovertible. The focus shifted immediately to the consequences, setting the stage for a new legal battle where the courtroom itself was the crime scene and the judge was the primary witness. 5 days after the violent outburst that disrupted the Clark County District Court, the machinery of the justice system resumed its motion with deliberate, icy precision. The date was the 8th of January 2024. The location was the same Regional Justice Center in Las Vegas where, less than a week prior, the sanctity of the bench had been physically shattered. However, the atmosphere inside Courtroom 3B had undergone a total transformation. What had been a standard procedural environment was now fortified to a degree reserved for the most volatile, high-risk defendants. The air was heavy with anticipation, not for a debate on legal merits, but for the completion of a sentence that had been violently interrupted. Security protocols were visibly overhauled. The courtroom, usually accessible to the public with standard screening, was now under a tight lockdown. Uniformed officers from the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department and court marshals lined the walls and the well of the court. The casual spacing of the previous hearing was gone, replaced by a strategic wall of law enforcement personnel positioned to intercept any movement instantly. The message was visual and absolute. There would be no second opportunity for chaos. Deobra Redden was brought into the room, but he bore little resemblance to the man who had stood in a casual shirt and slacks just days earlier. The transition from a defendant seeking probation to a high-security prisoner was starkly illustrated by his restraints. He was dressed in standard prison-issue administrative segregation orange. His hands were not merely cuffed, they were encased in protective mitts, thick padded coverings secured at the wrists to prevent him from grasping, grabbing, or manipulating objects. These mitts were chained to a waist belt, restricting his arm movement to a few inches from his torso. His ankles were shackled with heavy irons that shortened his stride to a shuffle, eliminating the possibility of running or vaulting. Most striking was the white mesh spit mask covering his head and face. Translucent and hood-like, the device is designed to prevent a combative detainee from spitting on or biting officers. But in this context, it served as a grim muzzle. It obscured his expressions, rendering him a faceless figure of state custody. He was escorted by a phalanx of 6 officers who surrounded him in a tight perimeter, moving in lockstep as they guided him to the defense table. He was not permitted to sit in the standard chair. Instead, he remained standing, flanked closely by the guards, who kept their hands near their holsters and tasers. Judge Mary Kay Holthus entered the courtroom shortly after Redden was positioned. Her return to the bench was a significant statement in itself. Despite having suffered injuries from the impact of the attack, including soreness and a head injury from hitting the wall behind, her demeanor was composed and businesslike. There were no visible bandages, only a palpable rigidness in the room as she took her seat. She did not look at Redden with fear or anger. She looked at him with the detached authority of the court. The purpose of this hearing was strictly procedural, to finalize the sentencing for the attempted battery with substantial bodily harm charge involving the baseball bat attack on a family member. This was the legal matter at hand when Redden had launched himself over the dais. Legally, the attack on the judge was a separate incident that would generate new charges, but for this specific morning, the court had to finish what it started. Judge Holthus wasted no time on preambles. She did not address the assault that had occurred 120 hours earlier. She did not lecture the defendant on his behavior, nor did she offer him a chance to speak. The time for allocution, the defendant's right to address the court, before sentencing had passed during the previous hearing. Redden's opportunity to advocate for himself had ended the moment he left his feet on January 3rd. Addressing the court record, Judge Holthus spoke with a steady, unyielding tone. She acknowledged the interruption of the previous proceedings and stated her intention to simply complete the sentence she had been in the middle of pronouncing. It was a crucial judicial maneuver. By sticking precisely to the sentence she had formulated before the attack, she insulated the ruling from future appeals. She ensured that no defense attorney could later argue that the sentence for the battery charge was inflated by vindictiveness over the courtroom assault. "I want to make it clear," Judge Holthus stated, her voice echoing in the silent room, "that I am not changing or modifying the sentence I was in the process of imposing last week." She then delivered the judgment. For the crime of attempted battery with substantial bodily harm, Deobra Redden was sentenced to a minimum of 19 months and a maximum of 48 months in the Nevada Department of Corrections. It was the standard guideline sentence she had intended to give him all along, the very sentence that had triggered his rage when he realized probation was off the table. The irony was palpable. His violent attempt to avoid prison had not altered the duration of this specific confinement by a single day. Redden stood motionless behind the defense table, his face obscured by the mesh hood. There were no outbursts. The heavy restraints and the overwhelming show of force made physical resistance impossible, and the silence from the defense table suggested a resignation to the immediate reality. His attorney, Cesar Almaze, who had also been present during the attack, stood nearby, but had little role to play in this purely administrative conclusion. The judge ordered the credit for time served, a standard calculation for days Redden had already spent in jail, awaiting this disposition. The administrative details were read into the record swiftly. The entire proceeding took only a few minutes. It was clinical, devoid of the emotional volatility that had characterized the previous encounter. The court clerk typed the disposition into the registry, legally sealing the case of the baseball bat attack. With the sentence pronounced, Judge Holthus ordered Redden remanded to the custody of the sheriff for transport to the Department of Corrections. The officers immediately pivoted, turning Redden toward the side exit. The chains rattled against the floor as he was shuffled out of the courtroom, the spit mask still in place. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving the courtroom in a heavy silence. This hearing closed the book on the original charge, but it was merely the prologue to a much more severe legal battle. As Redden was led back to the holding cells, the 19 to 4 8-month sentence became a secondary concern. The events of January 3rd had spawned a new indictment, one that carried consequences far exceeding a 4-year maximum. While the judge returned to her docket and the marshals stood down from high alert, the legal system began to turn its wheels toward the new charges of attempted murder, extortion, and battery on a protected person. The 9 to 4 8-month sentence was now simply the baseline, a holding pattern, while the state prepared to prosecute the viral act of violence that had shocked the world. The original case was closed, but the consequences of the attack were only just beginning to materialize. The video footage that circulated the globe served a dual purpose. For the public, It was a shocking spectacle of courtroom chaos. For the Clark County District Attorney's Office and the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department, it was high-definition evidence of intent. Investigators immediately began a frame-by-frame analysis of the leap. The trajectory of Deobra Redden's body, the position of his hands, and the specific target of his aggression were scrutinized to determine the appropriate criminal charges. This was not merely a scuffle. The state viewed it as a targeted strike against the judiciary itself. The initial review of the security breach highlighted a catastrophic failure in the architecture of courtroom safety. The separation between the gallery, the defense table, and the bench, traditionally viewed as an inviolable buffer zone, had been traversed in seconds. Court administration and the Marshals Division conducted an internal audit of the reaction times. While the marshal seated near Judge Mary Kay Holthus had attempted to intervene, the speed of the assault rendered standard protocols ineffective. The investigation revealed that Redden had bypassed the physical barrier of the defense table and covered the distance to the bench before law enforcement could effectively neutralize the threat. This operational analysis was critical, not only for upgrading future security measures but for establishing the prosecution's narrative, that Redden moved with athleticism, purpose, and clarity of mind, undermining any potential defense regarding a sudden loss of motor control or unawareness. District Attorney Steve Wolfson publicly signaled the state's aggressive stance. The injuries sustained by Judge Holthus, which included soreness, stiffness, and head trauma from the impact against the wall, alongside the injuries to the marshal who suffered a dislocated shoulder and a gash requiring stitches, formed the basis of the physical evidence. However, it was the nature of the attack that dictated the severity of the new indictment. Prosecutors argued that Redden's hands had gone toward the judge's throat and that he had struck her head, actions that elevated the offense beyond simple battery. On the 1st of February 2024, a grand jury convened to hear the evidence. The process was swift, shielded from the public eye, but decisive in its outcome. The grand jury returned an indictment charging Deobra Redden with 9 counts. The most severe among them was attempted murder of an older person. The indictment alleged that Redden had the specific intent to kill Judge Holthus when he vaulted the bench, citing his hands seizing her and the violent force used to slam her against the infrastructure of the courtroom. Beyond the attempted murder charge, the grand jury indicted him on battery on a protected person resulting in substantial bodily harm, referring to the injuries sustained by the marshal, and extortion. The extortion charge was a legally technical but significant addition, based on the theory that Redden used violence to impede a public officer from performing their lawful duty, specifically the imposition of a custodial sentence. Other charges included intimidating a public officer and battery by a prisoner. The filing of these charges necessitated a new series of court appearances, which stood in stark contrast to the hearing where the attack occurred. The casual atmosphere of the January 3rd proceeding was replaced by maximum security protocols typically reserved for the most dangerous offenders in the penal system. When Redden appeared for his arraignment on the new indictment, the visual transformation was absolute. He was no longer standing freely next to an attorney. Instead, he was transported into the courtroom by a phalanx of uniformed officers. His hands were encased in protective mitts to prevent grasping or striking, chained to his waist. Leg shackles restricted his movement to a slow shuffle, and a spit mask covered the lower half of his face, obscuring his expression. Because Judge Holthus was the named victim in the case, she could not preside over the new proceedings. The case was assigned to District Judge Susan Johnson. To prevent any further outbursts or security risks, the court implemented a zero-tolerance policy for movement. Redden was positioned well away from the bench, flanked constantly by multiple officers who remained within arm's reach. The courtroom gallery, previously open, was subjected to tighter screening, and the atmosphere was thick with tension. Every motion Redden made was tracked by the eyes of the marshals, who were now operating on a heightened state of alert. During these preliminary hearings, the defense attempted to navigate the complexities of Redden's mental state. They requested a competency evaluation, a standard procedure in cases of inexplicable violence, to determine if Redden understood the charges against him and could assist in his own defense. The defense attorney argued that the behavior exhibited in the video was indicative of a mental health crisis rather than a calculated attempt on a life. They posited that Redden had snapped due to a combination of mental health issues and the stress of the sentencing, attempting to mitigate the element of premeditation required for the attempted murder charge. The state, however, remained steadfast. Prosecutors pointed to the verbal exchange immediately preceding the jump. Redden's statement, "Nah, fuck that," uttered the moment Judge Holthus denied probation, was presented as evidence of a conscious decision-making process. They argued that his anger was a rational, albeit violent, reaction to receiving a sentence he did not want, rather than a symptom of legal insanity. The investigation into his background for the new indictment also highlighted a history of violent offenses which the prosecution used to establish a pattern of conduct. They portrayed the courtroom attack not as an anomaly, but as an escalation of a violent disposition that the justice system had failed to contain. The competency evaluation was conducted by state psychiatrists who reviewed Redden's history and interviewed him in the detention center. The findings were returned to the court, declaring Redden competent to stand trial. This ruling was a pivotal moment in the procedural timeline. It stripped away the potential for an infinite delay in a mental health facility and placed Redden squarely on the path to a criminal trial or a plea negotiation. With competency established, the focus shifted entirely to the facts of the assault and the legal definitions of the charges. Throughout the spring and summer of 2024, the pretrial maneuverings continued. The defense sought to challenge the attempted murder designation, arguing that while the assault was battery, there was no weapon and no sustained strangulation that would prove an intent to end the judge's life. They characterized the event as a tantrum with severe consequences, but not a homicide attempt. The prosecution countered by emphasizing the vulnerability of the victim, a judge seated and trapped behind a desk, and the extreme violence of the tackle. They argued that vaulting a judicial bench to attack a sitting judge was an act of such extreme defiance and aggression that it inherently carried a disregard for human life. The extortion charge also became a focal point of the legal debate. The state argued that the attack was a physical manifestation of an attempt to coerce the justice system. By attacking the judge, Redden was, in the state's view, attempting to punish the court for its ruling and intimidate the judiciary as a whole. This framing elevated the case from a personal injury matter to a defense of the rule of law. The indictment was crafted to ensure that the penalty would reflect the institutional damage caused by the breach. Redden entered a plea of not guilty to all charges in the new indictment. He ultimately entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity, a strategy that would require the defense to prove he was unable to distinguish right from wrong at the exact moment of the attack. This plea set the stage for a potential trial that would feature the viral video as the centerpiece of evidence. The court scheduled hearings to debate the admissibility of prior bad acts and to settle jury instructions. However, as the trial date approached, the reality of the evidence weighed heavily. The video was irrefutable proof of the act itself. The only variable was the interpretation of intent. The prospect of a trial, where the footage would be played on a loop for a jury, posed a significant risk for the defense. The visceral nature of the video, combined with the testimony of the judge and the injured marshal, created a steep hill to climb for any acquittal. Behind the scenes, the security protocols around Redden became the new standard for high-risk defendants in Clark County. His transport from the high desert state prison to the regional justice center was treated as a tactical operation. The courthouse, which had been criticized for the lapse, reinforced the physical barriers in courtrooms and reviewed staffing levels for bailiffs. The investigation into the incident had effectively concluded that while the physical infrastructure had vulnerabilities, the primary cause was the unpredictable and explosive violence of the defendant. By late 2024, the legal pathways narrowed. The investigation was complete, the charges were solidified by the grand jury, and the competency questions were resolved. The state had built a fortress of evidence around the 9 counts. The attempted murder charge carried a sentence that could effectively keep Redden incarcerated for the rest of his life. The negotiations between the defense and the prosecution began to reflect the overwhelming nature of the case. The question was no longer whether Redden attacked the judge, but how many decades that split-second decision would cost him. The court prepared for a final resolution, moving toward a judgment day that would address the violence that had shattered the decorum of Department 24. The attempted murder charges looming over Deobra Redden mandated a shift in strategy for the defense. Facing a trial where video evidence of the assault was irrefutable, Redden's legal team, led by attorney Carl Arnold, moved to resolve the case without subjecting the court and the victims to a protracted jury proceeding. On the 7th of November 2024, Redden stood before District Judge Susan Johnson, who had been assigned the case to ensure impartiality, given Judge Holthus's status as the victim. In a controlled and heavily guarded courtroom, Redden entered a plea of guilty but mentally ill to 6 counts. These charges included attempted murder for the attack on Judge Holthus, battery on a protected person resulting in substantial bodily harm for the injuries sustained by Marshal Shane Jensen, and battery on a protected person regarding the law clerk, Michael Lasso. The designation of guilty but mentally ill was a pivotal legal distinction. It did not absolve Redden of criminal responsibility, nor did it function as an insanity defense, which might have sent him to a psychiatric facility instead of prison. Rather, the plea acknowledged that while Redden suffered from a mental health condition specifically diagnosed as paranoid schizophrenia, he was nonetheless culpable for his violent actions. Under Nevada law, this classification allows the Department of Corrections to provide mental health treatment within the prison system, but it ensures the defendant serves their time in a correctional facility. By accepting the plea, the state dropped several other charges, streamlining the path to the final judgment. Sentencing was scheduled for the 10th of December 2024. The atmosphere in the Regional Justice Center was markedly different from the casual, routine proceedings of the previous January. Security protocols were at their maximum threshold. When Redden entered the courtroom, he was shackled and surrounded by a phalanx of correction officers, a visual testament to the system's determination to prevent a recurrence of the chaos that had garnered millions of views worldwide. He wore the standard navy blue prison uniform, his demeanor subdued, standing in stark contrast to the explosive figure seen in the viral footage. Judge Susan Johnson presided over the hearing with a stern focus on the gravity of the offense. The proceedings began with the presentation of victim impact details and the state's arguments for a maximum sentence. Chief Deputy District Attorney Elizabeth Mercer addressed the court, characterizing the attack not merely as an assault on an individual, but as a direct strike against the administration of justice. Mercer argued that Redden constituted a unique and extreme danger to the community, highlighting that his violence was triggered simply by being told no by an authority figure. The prosecution emphasized that the attack was unprovoked and occurred in what is supposed to be one of the safest rooms in society. The court heard detailing regarding the physical and emotional toll on the victims. Judge Mary Kay Holthus, though physically recovered from the immediate injuries which included slamming her head against a wall and suffering bruises from falling debris, carried the psychological weight of the ambush. The attack had shattered the assumption of safety that judges rely upon to administer the law without fear or favor. The narrative presented by the prosecution painted a picture of a courtroom permanently altered, where staff members were forced to look over their shoulders and where the sanctity of the bench had been violated. Marshal Shane Jensen, who had borne the brunt of Redden's physical strength during the struggle, faced lasting consequences. Reports indicated that Jensen had suffered a dislocated shoulder, a gash on his face requiring stitches, and a hairline fracture of his tibia. The violence required to inflict such injuries on a trained law enforcement officer underscored the ferocity of Redden's outburst. Law clerk Michael Lasso, credited with acting swiftly to pull Redden off the judge, also dealt with minor injuries and the trauma of the violent intervention. The prosecution utilized these details to argue against leniency, positing that Redden's actions demonstrated a complete lack of impulse control and a disregard for human life. Defense attorney Carl Arnold mounted a mitigation argument focused on Redden's mental health history. Arnold contended that his client was not a monster, but a sick man who had fallen through the cracks of the mental health system. He argued that at the time of the January attack, Redden was unmedicated and experiencing a severe episode of his schizophrenia. Arnold pleaded for the court to consider the guilty but mentally ill designation as a mandate for help rather than purely punitive warehousing. He asked Judge Johnson to impose a sentence that would offer a chance at rehabilitation, suggesting that with proper medication and therapy, Redden could eventually function without posing a threat. Redden himself was given the opportunity to speak. He offered an apology, stating that he was in a better place mentally than he had been during the attack, and expressing regret for the harm he caused to the judge and her staff. Judge Johnson, however, remained focused on the severity of the act and the defendant's extensive criminal history. In her sentencing remarks, she dismantled the notion that mental illness alone could excuse the sheer violence displayed. She noted that Redden had a long history of violent offenses and probation violations, indicating a pattern of behavior that extended beyond a single unmedicated episode. Judge Johnson addressed the terror inflicted upon the courtroom staff, stating that the video of the incident shocked the conscience of the community and the world. She emphasized that a courtroom must be a sanctuary, where disputes are resolved with words and laws, not brute force. The judge's ruling was methodical and severe. She sentenced Deobra Redden to a total aggregate term of 26 to 65 years in the Nevada Department of Corrections. To reach this figure, Judge Johnson ran the sentences for the various counts consecutively rather than concurrently. For the attempted murder of Judge Holthus, she imposed a significant sentence reflecting the intent and the target of the violence. Additional consecutive terms were added for the battery on a protected person regarding Marshall Jensen and the battery regarding Michael Lasso. By stacking the sentences, Judge Johnson ensured that Redden would not be eligible for parole for decades. In her final pronouncement, Judge Johnson explained that the consecutive nature of the sentencing was necessary to protect the public. She characterized Redden as a danger to society, someone whose unpredictable rage made him unfit for freedom. The sentence was designed to ensure that he would be an elderly man before he could even be considered for release. The judge explicitly noted that while the prison system was directed to provide him with psychiatric care, the primary objective of the court was incapacitation. The courtroom remained silent as the sentence was read. There were no outbursts, no leaps across the bench, and no chaotic scuffles. Redden stood stoically as the years piled up: 26 years minimum, 65 years maximum. The finality of the number signaled the end of the legal saga that had begun with a routine request for probation. The 6 to 6 5-year sentence effectively closed the door on Deobra Redden's life as a free man. As the hearing concluded, the marshals moved in to escort Redden from the courtroom. The clinking of chains was the only sound as he was turned away from the gallery and led toward the holding cells. This time there was no resistance. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung shut, sealing the conclusion of one of the most shocking incidents in American judicial history. The system, having been physically assaulted, had reasserted its authority through the rigid application of sentencing guidelines. Deobra Redden was transported to the High Desert State Prison to begin his term, entering the facility not just as an inmate, but as the central figure of a cautionary tale regarding courtroom security and the consequences of attacking the judiciary. The viral clip would circulate forever on the internet. But the reality for Redden was now confined to the rigid schedule of a maximum security penitentiary, where his guilty but mentally ill status would dictate his treatment for the next several decades.